Hi there, folks. My name's Alex Ford. I'm a Schools History Project Fellow and a Senior Lecturer at Leeds Trinity University. And before that, I used to be a Head of Department in a school in Leeds and in Harrogate. Welcome to this three-part series, which I'm entitling Communities of Principle Fighting for Justice in Education. In it, I hope to take you through some of the ideas around the concept of subject communities, which we're hearing a lot about at the moment. So in the first part, I want to look at, well, what subject communities are and the power of subject communities. In the second part, I want to look at maybe some of the problems around subject communities, and that's something I've blogged about over the past year, particularly. And in the final part, I would like to think about, well, how do we direct our time in subject communities? How can we ensure that we are fighting for justice in education, which, I think lots of us would think is important. So that's the aims of the series. In this first part, we'll look, as I say, at the power of communities and hopefully take you through some of the ways in which communities, particularly subject communities, can be especially powerful and helpful to us. So I'm going to start really with that idea of community. I'm sure all of us can think of a few things when we think of the idea of community and what that means to us. I think communities can be defined by three big things. First of all, communities often have shared experiences. Secondly, they have shared sets of values. And thirdly, those things help them have a shared sense of identity. If we're part of a community, it tells us something about us and it gives us a sense of identity, and that can be really important and really powerful. And those three things together enable the fourth thing, which is it enables people to take action. So if we think about the picture that I've got in the background here, and it commemorates the uprising of the Chartists who were protesting the unfairness of the political system of the time. So this is 1839, it's depicting 1839 at any rate. And you can see the Chartist community here, who through shared experiences of political alienation and maybe exploitation and shared value, give these Chartists in Newport a powerful sense of identity. And through those experiences, those values, that shared sense of identity, they are enabled to take action. And that leads them to protest for the vote and eventually to rise up and demand the vote. And that leads them into a violent confrontation with the authorities who react aggressively to this demand and these charters asking for this change. But that doesn't end it. The community is powerful enough that the ideas outlast this flashpoint, and they continue to influence. And of course, today we know that lots of the things that the Chartists were asking for in the 1830s and the 1840s have come to pass in our political system. And that's largely due to the way that community was influencing the development of political rights in Britain in that period. So community can be incredibly powerful. But as we will see as we go through, there can be problems in community, and we therefore need to think carefully about the responsibilities of being part of communities. So I want to talk about how we go from those kind of general sense of community to professional communities. Now, we see an awful lot more now of people talking about the idea that real curriculum change comes through discussion in subject communities. Christine Council here, long-standing traditions of practice and debate within subject communities concerning the ways of teaching, structure, status and origin of knowledge, etc. And we see it here again in the guidelines for what high-quality initial teacher education should look like now. It says that we should be directing trainees towards subject communities. And actually, I agree. I agree with Ofsted here. I think they are important. I think it's not just one professional community, though, and I think that's important to say. It's not just the subject community. There are many subject communities just within history. So when we talk about these sort of professional communities, these subject communities, I think it's worth thinking about, well, what are they? And I think beginning with the work of Lav and Wenger, they talked in their book Situated Learning about professional communities, and they talked very specifically about professional learning communities, and they say this about them. So they say that professional communities have shared sets of aims or principles, just like a community, and they're often grown from the ground up to meet needs, that they're bound by mutual engagement in the act of professional learning, that they result in a shared body of resources, vocabularies and understandings. Fifthly, that actually professional communities are more than consumptive places. That makes them sound like a disease, doesn't it? But they're not just places where you go to consume knowledge or resources. That participating in communities is just as important as what you get out of them at the end. And that they allow their members to refine their practice and have a positive impact on the learning of students in this case. What I want to do here is give you a more concrete example. So I want to introduce you to one of my history heroes. For those of you who don't know, this is Marc Bloch. And Marc Bloch was a French historian, born in Alsace at the turn of the previous century. So Bloch himself was part of many communities, of course. We've touched on some of these. He was French. He was very much a Republican and a belief in those ideals of liberty, fraternity, equality. He was part of a professional community of academics. He was certainly a scholar, definitely a historian. He was a medievalist. As I've said already, he was Jewish. So he has lots of communities, and those communities in turn give him a sense of identity and give him a sense of professional identity as well. But Bloch goes a step further. So he isn't just part of communities, he is also a creator of community. And in 1929, Marc Bloch, along with his longtime collaborator Lucien Febvre, set up a new professional community, which becomes known as the Annal School. And it's based around a journal, which you can see on the left-hand side here, which promotes a particular type of history. And what Bloch and Febvre are keen to do is create the centre point for a community of people who are also interested in promoting this kind of history. And they very much critique the kind of narrow, very political, very nationalistic kinds of history that are being studied and promoted and of course taught as well in France at the turn of the 20th century. And so what they promote through the journal and what they promote through this school, this community, this professional community they create, is the study of social and economic history as opposed to just political. They're very much into the idea that past needs to be humanised, that it's not just the study of great people in these kind of hero narratives, but actually we humanise the past by trying to understand the ways in which ordinary people thought. And we talk about the study of mentalities. They're interested in humanity. That needs to be done through a very careful, critical engagement with evidence, and that it must be done through a relentless pursuit of truth, not the truth, but of truth and justice. So that idea is we are not using history for, political and problematic political ends, but we are seeking the truth of the past and the humanity of the past. So they create this community, and the overarching principle, I suppose, for all of it is that it's meeting the needs of the people of France in the 20th century. Bloch talks about an endeavour towards better understanding. He talks about empowering the people of France through a proper study of history at a university level, which will filter down into the schools and everything else. And so in the long term, the Annal School fundamentally shifts, along with other movements as well, I have to say, but it fundamentally shifts the nature of the kind of history studied in France, but also much wider through Europe and beyond. The Annals, therefore, is not just a community of practice and a professional community, it's a community of change as well. We talked about communities leading to change. Bloch, in 1942, it was published in 1949, but in 1942, Bloch publishes a book called The Historian's Craft, which if you haven't read, please go and read it. It's the most amazing book. And it's a guide, he says, to writing history with, as he says, integrity and truth. And what I find fascinating about that book is it's very much Bloch's work. It's Bloch's writing, and his character comes through it really strongly. But it's equally the product of the thinking of this whole school, this whole community of people who've come together to think about what history could be and should be if it was conceived of in a broader and deeper way, as Bloch talks about here. So the power of the Annals professional community is pretty immense. It moves us towards a better understanding of history, a broader, deeper, more humanised understanding of history. And for Bloch, that aim is about his France. The Republic. He thinks the Republican France needs this kind of truth in its history if it's ever going to survive as a republic. So what do communities do? Well, in the Annals case, the community, the journal, the Annal School, empowers its members to talk and to have those discussions. It inspires them to want to do that through the discussions that had. It supports and it challenges them in creating this better history. And I think that's a wonderful model because it shows us a huge amount about what professional communities can do. Really good professional communities, like the way Christine Council talks here, long-standing traditions of practice and debate within subject communities, they can do the same things. They empower, they inspire, they support, they challenge teachers, history teachers especially in this case, to have better history lessons for young people. And of course, they are professionally enriching for the teachers who take part in them as well. Now, I want to introduce you for a minute to NQT Me, and I'll let you work out which one I am. It's an embarrassing photo to put up here, but anyway, here I am in my actually it's the end of my RQT year. So I spent 2 years at a school called RM Grills Middle and Community School in Liversedge, and this is a picture of me and the staff on the very last day of term, the day the school was shut down. The local authority shut it down. It had been underperforming. It was already in a very difficult area. It had been shut down once and reopened and then re-shut down again. And we're kind of standing in the broken shell of the school here. Everything's been cleaned out. A group of youths, local youths, came and smashed all the windows about a week. Came and smashed the windows about a term before we finished. So we taught most of the year with all the windows boarded up and nobody replaced them. Being part of that community was a really fundamentally crucial part of my identity as a new teacher. So I was very much part of this RM Grills Middle School community. We were a very close-knit community and we did a huge amount to support each other in the work we did right across that whole staff group. But as a history teacher, my community was really just me. I was kind of on my own. I was the only teacher of history in that school. And therefore, it was quite a lonely experience trying to work out what I should be teaching, how I should be teaching. I was drawing a little bit on my PGC, but again, not a lot prepared me for this. And it just felt like that community was to one side. Now, fast forward a little bit. I left that school because it closed, and I still call this RQT Me because I was kind of 2 years into teaching. I joined a new department, and the difference was pretty startling. And you can see the new department here. There's two people on the left who were part of that department. You can find me again on there. And the other two is they're a mathematician and a geographer who sneaked in. Now, this was a really, really different place to work, because this was a school where I was part of the HS Harrogate Grammar School community, but that school community identity was probably much less of an identifier for me than being part of that particular history department. I suppose there were lots of things that made it a really good professional community. The head of department, Barbara, who's in green there, used to go off and she used to bring in books all the time. So she would come back at a weekend and she'd say, I found these books. They were selling off these in a bargain bookstore. She'd love to go to those. And she would bring us in books and we'd read the books and we'd go home, we'd read the books, we'd come back in a couple of weeks and we'd talk about the books. And we'd think about how we could change the way we taught certain topics. And it was really enriching. The office was just full of professional discussions all the time about what we were teaching and how we were teaching it and whether we should maybe alter the way we were teaching something else. And through that department, I was also encouraged to take part in other communities. So for the first time, really, I was introduced to things like the Princess Teaching Institute and the Historical Association and their journal, Teaching History. And Katie, who's on the left, was very much responsible for me getting into that. So I read articles really for the first time, because I didn't do a lot of it at PGCE. So I read Christine Council on developing students' evidential thinking. I read Chapman and Woodcock on causation, and Alphonse the Camel made an appearance in my history lessons. I was also part as well of the School's History Project, and we were encouraged, if not given a 3-line whip, to go along to conferences like the School's History Project Conference and the Historical Association Conference. And I suppose it was the School's History Project where I really found my home, and here I am, many years later, in that project still. What was it about School's History Project? Well, School's History Project went even a step further than some of those other bodies that I've talked about there. So everything helped me understand my teaching better, and those communities came together to help me get better as a teacher. But the SHP, the School's History Project, was rooted in principles. And for those of you who don't know much about SHP, it started in the 1970s as a project to rethink what school history could be by meeting the needs of young people in a comprehensive education system. And those principles underpin its work, and a huge amount of its work has gone into exam board schemes of work and, crucially, textbooks, which have been a staple for a long time. And it has those things kind of underpin the work it does in those. And it has these 6 amazing principles, I think. First, that school history should be meaningful and enable young people to better understand their world. That it should involve disciplined inquiry and enable them to develop ideas and opinions about the past, not just receive knowledge, but actually think about that knowledge and develop their ideas about it. That it should, of course, build knowledge for the past and respect for people who lived there, so very much like Bloch and Annals. That it should be broad and inclusive and reflect diversity in modern Britain. The school's history should enable young people to see history and the environment around them, and develop leisure interests around that, interest in going to these places. And crucially, I'm really, at the end here, that it should be enjoyable, accessible, and life-enhancing for all. And I think those principles are such powerful, such important things. And they really underpin, as I've said, the work the Schools History Project does. And it wasn't just the textbooks that inspired me, but going to the conferences. And every summer, the Schools History Project conference, I would go along to that, and we would have an amazing time listening to other teachers, just like us, talking about how they'd brought some of these principles into practice in their classroom, and then we'd go away and we'd try them out. And I can remember going to my first one of those and just being amazed that I'd spent an entire day going to listen to people talk about teaching history, and then spent the evening in the bar talking to more people about how we were going to try some of those ideas out, and then agreeing with each other to have a chat about how it had gone, and kind of making those connections that true communities have in them. And you can see here Ian Dawson running one of his very famous Saturday night sessions and getting people up and being silly, but also in a serious way to think about how we can teach children in an enjoyable, accessible, life-enhancing way. And those conferences became a real centre point for the kinds of professional development that I did. And through this community of people that I, started to make friends in, and then started to work alongside some of these people and communicated with these people, we started to make alterations. Partly, first of all, in departments where I was a member, and later as a head of department as well. So we started bringing in some work based on Michael Riley's work on medieval Baghdad, looking at a comparative of Baghdad in AD 800 and London in AD 800, and kind of looking at the similarities and differences there and broadening students' horizons. We wanted to get in some work that we'd seen about getting more historians and historical representation and interpretation into the classroom. And so we started out with a book that was quite popular at the time, the Horrible History series, and we asked this question: why do we have to be so careful when telling stories about the Aztecs? So again, diversifying students' experiences, but also helping them see how and why history is constructed. So we started with books like this and thought about, well, what are the problems here? And then we went over to the evidence we have and the sources we have from the Aztecs in this period. And we looked at, well, okay, so where are the problems? Why has it been constructed in this way? And we started to get them to see that. And we did a similar thing with local history. So Harewood House down the road from us in Leeds doesn't tell us an awful lot about its past. You can go there, you can do some lovely walks, you can see their delightful furniture that they spent millions of pounds on. But if you look at the history section of their website, it has very, very little. And this was a unit that Katie developed, and we later shared with other schools as well. And it talks very much in here about the Earls of Harwood being involved with the West Indies trade, the West Indian sugar trade and the West Indies trade, and this very euphemistic way of talking about it. And we kind of asked, okay, so why does Harewood House not want to say slavery in here? What are they not saying? And obviously we get very quickly to that. So we wanted to have things like that in there. And again, this all came out of these discussions we were having and things we'd been to at Schools History Project Conference and wider things as well. These were kind of ideas that were coming out of communities. That community empowered us, inspired us, supported and challenged us to produce a kind of history that we felt young people were really benefiting from, that was rigorous, that was life enhancing, that was powerful. And that came not just from being part of a community and taking part in it, but being part of a community that had principles that enabled us to get to those endpoints. So communities can be really powerful, and I hope I've illustrated that. It's not, we have a massively limited amount of time as teachers. Sometimes it feels like being part of a community, going to a conference, reading some stuff might feel like too much. But actually, it gives us freedom. It allows us to do things better. It gets us excited about why we became history teachers in the first place. It really does liberate as well as giving you more things to do. So I hope that's come across there. In the next session, I want to go on and look at some of the problems inherent in communities, and we'll start to unpick the ways in which communities don't always act in positive ways, and maybe sometimes end up raising more problems than they solve. So do join me back for that next time. And if you want to find out any more about the Schools History Project, please do go and visit our website. You're also welcome to come and have a chat with me about anything on here on Twitter at APF102, and Schools History Project on Twitter is at 1972SHP. Thank you very much for listening.